An 80-year-old widow enters Judge Harper's courtroom for what appears to be an ordinary unpaid rent dispute involving $2,541. Dressed in a neatly ironed floral dress, she clutches an old leather handbag tightly against her chest while leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Her frail hands shake as she lowers herself into the defendant's chair. Her eyes are swollen from hours of crying. Her name is Eleanor Whitmore, and before this hearing ends, she will reveal a truth so heartbreaking that Judge Harper will do something no one has ever witnessed in her 28 years on television. She will rise from the bench, walk across the courtroom in silence, and everyone present will realize this is not simply a landlord-tenant case. It is the story of a broken system, impossible sacrifice, and the devastating choices elderly Americans are forced to make every single day. The plaintiff is Daniel Morrison, a 62-year-old landlord who owns a modest 12-unit apartment building in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. But Daniel is not just Eleanor's landlord. For more than 5 decades, he was Thomas Whitmore's closest friend. The two men fought together in Vietnam in 1968. They survived combat side by side and returned home like brothers. For 43 years, Eleanor and Thomas rented the same apartment from Daniel, never once missing a payment. Month after month, year after year, the rent was always paid on time until 3 months ago. Then suddenly, the payments stopped. Eleanor stopped answering the phone. She ignored Daniel's knocks at the door. She disappeared behind silence. And now Daniel Morrison, despite loving Thomas like family, despite the friendship that stretched across half a century, has no choice but to sue the widow of his best friend for unpaid rent and possession of the apartment. What nobody in the courtroom knows yet, not even Daniel, is the reason Eleanor stopped paying. And when she finally tells the truth, it leaves the entire room shattered. Before Eleanor reveals the confession that leaves Judge Harper speechless, let me tell you why this story matters. Because this is not just one woman's tragedy. It is the reality millions of elderly Americans live every day. One medical emergency away from losing everything they spent their entire lives building. Eleanor Whitmore met Thomas in 1964 at a church social in Brooklyn. She was 22 years old, working as an elementary school teacher with dreams of a quiet and meaningful life. Thomas was 24, employed by the Postal Service, earning a living paycheck by paycheck while trying to build a future. They fell in love through shared values and simple dreams. In 1965, they married in a small ceremony surrounded by family and close friends. Over the next 58 years, they built a life together rooted in patience, sacrifice, and loyalty. Eleanor spent 35 years teaching second grade, shaping generations of children. Thomas worked for 40 years delivering mail through rain, snow, and unbearable heat, always greeting people with kindness. They lived carefully. They avoided debt. They saved every extra dollar they could. They drove the same car for 15 years, clipped coupons, skipped luxuries, and took modest vacations. And after nearly 6 decades of discipline and sacrifice, they managed to save $127,000 for retirement. It was not wealth, but it was security. It was peace of mind. It was the promise that their final years together would be stable and safe. They had 2 children. Their daughter Emily died in a tragic car accident in 1998, a loss that nearly destroyed both of them. Their son Lucas eventually moved to California, and over time distance created emotional walls that became harder to cross. There were grandchildren Eleanor barely knew because years and geographies slowly separated the family. But through all of it, Eleanor and Thomas still had each other. Inside their small rent-controlled apartment, surrounded by photographs, memories, and 58 years of shared history, they were content. Daniel Morrison had always treated them like family. He rarely increased the rent. If something broke, he handled it himself. When life became difficult, he gave them patience and understanding. This was never just business. This was family. Then, 18 months ago, everything changed. Thomas Whitmore was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Doctors estimated he had 6 months to live. 9 if they were lucky, but there was an experimental treatment available. It was not approved for Thomas's stage of cancer, so Medicare refused to cover it. Their insurance company denied the claim immediately. Still, the treatment offered hope, maybe more time, maybe a few more memories, maybe a few more mornings waking up beside the person you loved most. The treatment cost $8,400 every month. And Eleanor Whitmore looked at the man she had loved for 58 years. The man who stood beside her through every joy and every tragedy. and made a decision that would eventually cost her everything. She chose Thomas over money. She chose time over security. She chose love over survival. For 16 months, Eleanor paid for those treatments. Every month, $8,400 disappeared from their savings. She watched decades of sacrifice vanish piece by piece. The retirement account that once represented safety began shrinking rapidly, month after month. But Thomas stayed alive, so Eleanor kept paying. She sat beside him during every treatment. She held his hand through the nausea and pain. She read his favorite books aloud. She played songs from their wedding day and reminded him he was never alone. After 8 months, every dollar in their retirement account was gone. 58 years of saving had disappeared completely. But Thomas was still alive, still smiling at her, still squeezing her hand every morning. So Eleanor turned to credit cards, 5 different cards. One after another, she maxed them out, trying to buy more time with the man she loved. The debt climbed higher and higher because stopping treatment meant accepting Thomas's death sooner. And Eleanor could not bear that thought. 3 months ago, she faced an impossible choice. She had only $847 left in her checking account. The rent was due. Thomas's treatment was due. She could not pay both. Sitting at the same kitchen table where they had shared breakfast for more than 4 decades, Eleanor made the decision that still haunts her every night. She paid for Thomas's treatment. She chose another week holding his hand instead of keeping a roof over her head. And then she made the same choice again the following month, and again after that. Every month she found rent notices at the door. Every month she heard Daniel Morrison knocking and asking if she was all right. But she could not face him. How could she explain that she was willing to become homeless just to keep her husband alive a little longer? The shame consumed her, but love outweighed the shame. 8 weeks ago, Thomas Whitmore died in the bedroom they had shared for 58 years. Eleanor held his hand as he took his final breath and whispered that she loved him. The treatment gave him 7 extra months beyond the doctor's original prediction. 7 months that cost $127,000 in savings. 7 months that left Eleanor buried under $31,000 in credit card debt. 7 months that cost her financial security, her future, and possibly her home. The funeral was small. Daniel Morrison attended, confused and hurt by Eleanor's silence during the previous months. Lucas flew in from California for 2 days before returning home. The grandchildren sent flowers, then everyone left, and Eleanor returned alone to an apartment filled with memories and unpaid bills. The eviction notice arrived 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral. Now she sits in Judge Harper's courtroom, facing the possibility of losing the last remaining piece of her life with Thomas. Judge Harper studies the case file before speaking in her usual firm tone. Mr. Morrison, you are suing Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore for 3 months of unpaid rent totaling $2,541 and requesting possession of the apartment. Why did you bring this case? Daniel rises slowly. The pain in his face is impossible to miss. Your Honor, Eleanor Whitmore has lived in my building for 43 years, but she's more than a tenant. Her husband, Thomas, was my best friend. We fought together in Vietnam. We were like brothers. His voice trembles. I love Thomas, and I care about Eleanor too. But she stopped paying rent 3 months ago. She stopped answering my calls. I knocked on her door over and over, but she wouldn't speak to me. Property taxes have gone up. I've got my own medical problems. I can't afford tenants who stop paying, especially when they won't explain why. Judge Harper nods thoughtfully before turning toward Eleanor. The elderly woman grips her purse tightly while tears stream silently down her face. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Harper says more gently, Mr. Morrison says you stopped paying rent and refused communication. What is your response? Eleanor opens her mouth, but nothing comes out except a broken sob. The courtroom falls into uncomfortable silence as she struggles to find the words. Finally, in barely more than a whisper, she says, My husband died. The atmosphere shifts instantly. Daniel Morrison looks stunned. He clearly did not know Thomas had passed so recently. Judge Harper leans forward. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm very sorry for your loss. When did your husband pass away? 8 weeks ago, Eleanor replies, softly. Judge Harper's expression changes. I understand that you're grieving, Mrs. Whitmore. But your rent stopped 3 months ago, before your husband died. Help me understand what happened. Eleanor takes a trembling breath. 18 months ago, my Thomas was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Doctors said he had 6 months to live. Her voice shakes harder with every word. There was an experimental treatment that might give him more time, but insurance wouldn't cover it. Medicare denied it too. It cost $400 every month. The courtroom grows silent. We spent our whole lives saving $127,000. We were careful with every dollar for 58 years because we believed it would protect us when we got old. Tears slide down her cheeks. But when the doctor said the treatment could give Thomas more time, how was I supposed to tell my husband he wasn't worth the money? How do you choose savings over the person you've loved since you were 22 years old? Several people in the gallery wipe away tears. So I paid for the treatment every month. I watched our savings disappear little by little. But Thomas was still alive. He still held my hand. He still told me he loved me. She presses a soaked tissue against her face. After 8 months, the savings were gone, every penny. But the treatments kept him alive, so I started using credit cards. 5 of them. I went $31. Zuzo's into debt because I couldn't stop trying to save him. Daniel Morrison covers his mouth in shock. Judge Harper sits motionless. Eleanor's voice drops lower. 3 months ago, I had exactly $847 left. The rent was due. Thomas's treatment was due. I could only pay 1. She looks directly at Judge Harper. So I chose my husband. The room remains frozen. I chose 7 more days holding his hand over having a place to live. And then I made the same choice the next month. And again after that. Her voice breaks completely. Thomas died 8 weeks ago. After 16 months of treatment, after we lost everything we spent our lives building, he lived exactly 7 months longer than doctors predicted. She lowers her head. And do you know what I did with those 7 months? I sat beside him every day. I held his hand. I read him books. I played our wedding music. I made sure he never felt alone or afraid. People throughout the courtroom openly cry now. So yes, Mr. Morrison, I owe you $2,540, but I have no way to pay it. I'm 80 years old, I'm alone, I have no savings. After my bills and medications, I have about $400 left every month. In 30 days, I'll probably be homeless. She pauses. But Your Honor, I would do it all again. Judge Harper says nothing. For the first time in 28 years on television, the judge sits speechless. Slowly, she removes her glasses, revealing eyes filled with tears. Then, without a word, she rises from the bench. The bailiff looks confused. The audience freezes. Judge Harper walks down toward Eleanor and gently places a hand on her shoulder. Mrs. Whitmore, she says quietly. Voice heavy with emotion, look at me. Eleanor raises tearful eyes. In nearly 3 decades, I've heard every excuse imaginable for unpaid debts. Lies. Manipulation. Fake sympathy stories. She pauses. But this isn't an excuse, this is a tragedy. And it's happening in homes across this country every single day. Judge Harper turns toward Daniel Morrison. Mr. Morrison, if Thomas Whitmore were sitting here today instead of Eleanor, if your best friend had spent everything he owned trying to save her life and then came to you unable to pay rent, what would you have done? Daniel stands immediately, tears running down his face. I would have told him to forget the rent completely. Thomas was my brother. He turns toward Eleanor. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call me? I would have helped somehow. Eleanor's voice trembles. I was ashamed. I couldn't even keep a roof over our heads. Judge Harper speaks firmly. Mrs. Whitmore, you did not fail. The system failed you. Her voice echoes through the courtroom. A country that forces an elderly woman to choose between keeping her husband alive and keeping her home has failed. She points toward Eleanor. You sacrificed everything for the man you loved. That is not failure. That is extraordinary love. Daniel Morrison suddenly walks to the defendant's table and tears the lawsuit papers in half. Your Honor, I'm dropping the case. Eleanor owes me nothing. He wipes tears from his face. I should realized something was terribly wrong. Judge Harper nods slowly. That is generous, Mr. Morrison. But it still doesn't solve Mrs. Whitmore's situation. She still has $31,000 in medical debt and faces eviction. Then Judge Harper does something nobody expects. She pulls out her phone in open court and makes a call. The courtroom watches in stunned silence. I need the Patient Advocate Foundation and the National Council on Aging contacted immediately, she says firmly. Get Eleanor Whitmore connected with them today. She hangs up and faces Eleanor. Mrs. Whitmore, I cannot bring your husband back. I cannot restore the years or the money you spent trying to save him. Then she delivers words that leave the courtroom gasping. But I can make sure you do not lose your home. Judge Harper continues. My show will pay your entire $31,000 medical debt directly to your creditors. Every penny. Eleanor bursts into uncontrollable sobs as applause erupts throughout the courtroom. Judge Harper raises her voice over the noise. And we will also cover 6 months of rent so you have time to grieve properly and rebuild your life without fearing eviction. Daniel rushes toward Eleanor and embraces her tightly. I'm so sorry, he whispers. Thomas would never forgive me for letting you go through this alone. Eleanor clings to him. Thomas loved you so much, Daniel. He talked about you until the very end. 6 months later, Eleanor Whitmore is still living in her rent-controlled apartment in Bay Ridge, surrounded by the memories she and Thomas built together over 58 years. Her medical debt has been erased. She began grief counseling and finally started mourning her husband without the crushing terror of financial ruin hanging over her. Her son Lucas now calls every week, and slowly their relationship has begun healing. Daniel Morrison created the Thomas Whitmore Memorial Fund for elderly tenants facing medical emergencies so no one else in his building would ever suffer in silence again. The video of Eleanor's confession spread across the internet, viewed by millions. Thousands shared stories of families destroyed by medical debt. Advocacy organizations reported massive increases in calls from elderly people finally reaching out for help. And Eleanor now volunteers at a local hospice center, sitting beside dying patients, holding their hands, and making sure nobody leaves this world alone or afraid. Just as she did for Thomas, Eleanor Whitmore chose love over money. Judge Harper chose compassion over protocol. Daniel Morrison chose forgiveness over anger. And together, they reminded the world that even in the darkest moments, humanity still survives.